driving. So we're recording, and I have my computer on. I don't see anybody coming on right now, but I'll leave it on for a couple more minutes.
I don't think Gwenda will be here either.
Okay. Well, we'll be a little bit short, but that's all right.
Can I ask you a question?
Mhm.
On this latest confrontation in the Middle East, who fired the first shots over there? Who started it? Was it the Palestinians or the Israelis?
What started this one, and I was alluding to this last week, let's have a word of prayer, then I'll go into this and then segue ourselves into it. Lord God, we ask your blessing upon us as we study your word, as we think about the implications of living out the gospel in our lives, and we just pray for peace in our world, especially in the Middle East. And we know that it takes strong leaders on all sides to be able to pull off peace, and we just pray that that's the case for the people that are there being so adversely affected on all sides. So be with us, open our hearts, open our minds. In your name we pray.
Amen.
So what constituted this last one is, I'm going to go back a little bit. 1948, the state of Israel came about. The British mandate, the British controlled that area after the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I. So the British mandate was that they were going to control that area. The French controlled Lebanon, Syria, a little bit north. They divided it up. Still kind of colonial. And once they did that, in 1948, you had Israel, and then you had the West Bank, which was controlled by Jordan, and that included East Jerusalem. In '67 war, Israel took over East Jerusalem and other places, but it still has a high Arab population. And what constituted this last kerfuffle is that they were trying to kick out about 30 Palestinian families. They said that they had deeds that showed it was owned by the Jewish people beforehand, and which is kind of the root of all the things that are going on over there. The Israelis want more land for their people that are coming in, and they want to take it from, the Palestinians. Part of that has to do with water rights and other things as well. But that started, so they were going to kick out these 30 families, and everybody's been kind of waiting on this, and the court over there allowed that to start, and that started the Palestinians throwing rocks and things like that, and then it reciprocated back and forth, and then Gaza got involved with it, because it's always a good. None of you've been to Gaza, probably. No. It's an interesting area. It's one of the most densely populated places on the surface of the earth. If you look it up on Google and everything like that, you'll not see. It'll all look blurry pictures. In fact, if you look on Israel on Google and stuff like that, you'll see a lot of blurry satellite pictures, because they don't want to show actually what's on the ground in Israel or in Gaza, because they're afraid it's going to be used in a tactical way. So anyway, that's just kind of a little bit of an aside over there. So this is what's causing the problems there. Again, it's the Arab What is different this time, though, is that the Arab, because in Israel, 20% of the population is Arab. They stayed, after 48, they stayed in Israel, and they took on Israeli citizenship. They did not leave. 750,000 left and ended up in Jordan and in Syria, in Palestinian refugee camps. You've probably heard about those. Those people have been in refugee camps since 1948. They've generations of people. They're not allowed to work in these other countries, and so it's a mess. But they want to. These Palestinians want to come back to the places that they had known prior to 48. And that's called the right of return. That probably will never happen, because it doesn't serve the best interest of Israel right now. Part of the problem is the Arab population is growing much more than the Jewish population is, And so to maintain a Jewish state, they keep a lot of the Palestinians from receiving Arab Israeli citizenship, because they don't want to have more, get voted out of their own country. And so that's part of the tension. So you have all these people that live in the territories or in the occupied land. Territories is a word that the Israelis will use. Occupied land will be the word that the Arabs use for the exact same area. Gaza, Golan Heights, West Bank. So that's where it kind of started from. It's a land, and you've probably heard about the settlements over there. There's about 600,000 Israelis that live in these settlements that are on Palestinian land that they've just confiscated and oftentimes burned down the olive groves and stuff like that, because the Arabs tend to be very agriculturally oriented, and the Israelis come in and are more recently, they're more into business and commerce, and Israel produces a lot of defense, projects like the Iron Dome that they're using to shoot down the missiles and stuff like that. So they're involved with that. Yeah, a lot of diamonds are cut in Israel. Tel Aviv is, one of the diamond capitals of the world. So when diamonds come out of Africa, they usually go to either India, Tel Aviv, or Rotterdam. Those are the three areas that do most of the diamond cutting. So if you have any diamonds,
I thought they all went to,
Hmm?
I thought they all went to the Netherlands. They go to Tel Aviv?
Yeah, Tel Aviv, Rotterdam is a big area. And again, part of it is where the diamonds come from. If the diamonds come from South Africa, that's one place. A lot of diamonds come out of Russia as well. Not as, usually as good a grade, but, and that has nothing to do with anything, but it is part of the commerce that drives the Israeli economy. And, yeah. When you fly into Tel Aviv, Ben Gurion Airport and stuff like that, you realize that you're definitely in a first world country. When you go into the Palestinian land where they're not allowed to have any improvements, you were talking about infrastructure earlier, I was eavesdropping there a little bit. The roads and everything are horrible there because they don't have any tax bases. The Israelis control their water, control their electricity, all these things, turn it on and off arbitrarily. So it doesn't make for good neighbors, because they butt heads on a lot of things. I know a few Israeli Arabs that think that it's probably better for them to be Israeli Arabs because they probably get better rights, even as second-class citizens in Israel, than they would if they were just Palestinians who have no rights at all. So my friend Michael Zobi, and he and his family come. His wife is an Israeli. She grew up in Jerusalem, so she's has an Israeli passport. He grew up in Bethlehem, 6 miles away, which at the time was Jordan, and he's a couple years younger than I am. And so when he flies out, he has to fly out. He can't fly out Ben Gurion. He has to go into Jordan, and that's another trip. You have to go into Jordan to fly out of there because they won't allow the Palestinians to fly out of Ben Gurion Airport. Israeli Arabs, yes. Palestinians, no. So again, here's a couple. Michael and Carmen have 6 kids, and they're totally, one has Israeli, and gets Israeli health care, and the other one, he doesn't. He every time he is visiting his wife in Jerusalem, he's an illegal person and could be sent to prison.
Oh, my.
Oh yeah. I could tell you a lot of things. We smuggled he and his family across the because there's a border wall now that wasn't there back when I was living over there, but there's a border wall now that cuts through a lot of orchards and stuff like that to keep the Palestinians away from the Jewish people and the Jewish people away from the Palestinians because it's just the way it is.
Is there any solution to this kind of problem?
Well, there's always a solution. Is there a will for the solution? I mean, that's the question is, yeah, I mean, if what it does to both of them that really hurts is that tourism is huge over there. And I mean, it's big. It could be huge if they were at peace with each other. and they both would prosper. So there are people on both sides that would love to see that. I mean, the Israeli, hotel, organizations and stuff like that, they hate these wars, these flare-ups, because people are going, oh, well, we were gonna come over, and now we're going to, not. And so it really cripples what they do. And so there's a lot of Israelis that are not happy that there hasn't been appeasement with the Palestinians. And another group of Israelis that are that way are the ones that are involved with archaeology, because they see the damage that these wars do on archaeology, and you can't replace that. Once something goes boom, destroys something that could be of huge value. So, yeah, I'm gonna close this off. I don't see anybody else joining us. Where's that battery down?
Where's everybody?
Bill and Carolyn are she's getting her eyes dilated, so.
And John said Glenda had something else he thought, and Mary is preparing for a trip, and so she said, she called me last night, 8:30, to say, I don't think I can do this in Irma. I said, okay.
So here we live. So I always bring something, or I try to always bring something. So I brought an icon that I got in Nablus. And Nablus is where Jacob's well is. Get the right patriarch. So the Russians came. Well, it was either anyway. The Russians came in and were building a church in Nablus. Nablus is about 100. Oh, not that far. It's north of Jerusalem. It's at the foot of. It's where the Samaritans lived. Mount Gerizim is right there. And at the foot of it is a Nablus, a pretty large Arab town. And there was a Russian church that was being built over Jacob's well, because you can go into Jacob's well and you go down into the basement of this church, and in the basement of this church is a well. And this is the same well that Jesus was with the Samaritan woman. This is the same. And this is one of those places that is a surefire, this is where Jesus was. You can look down in the well, and depending on how far the water table, you can look down and see water to this day. Because that's where Jacob, when he went through there, dug a well there for all the sheep and animals that they had. So it's a very famous well. It's not on a tourist route because you have to go through a lot of Arab areas to get there. But anyway, I was there, so this is an icon. Icons are used by the Orthodox Church. They're two-dimensional because they don't want to be a graven image. Like where the Muslims have no really art. That's why calligraphy and all the beautiful architecture that has the Muslim influence. There's no stained glass in Islam, because they don't want to do a graven image. And so the Orthodox kind of went halfway on that. They like their icons because they venerate them. You go into their church and they hold them up and venerate them. But they don't want them to become a substitute for God, That's the whole idea is the icons point us to God. But to make sure that they're two-dimensional rather than three-dimensional, so you can see that. But it's an interesting art form. So I've studied over in the trip, I think I said Sunday, I was over there in the Ukraine and in Russia, and part of our study was icons. And
They're
because
big.
Oh, they're big over there. Yeah, every Orthodox church when you go in, the icon on the right, there's kind of the Holy of Holies up in the front. The one on the right is the one that's the church is named after. So if you can figure it out, you'll know the name of the church, because that's always the rule.
Is that Russian writing on the top?
Oh no, that's Greek.
Greek.
Yeah, which is not all that far from. Greece and Russia, are both Orthodox areas, and so if you go to like Cyprus and Rhodes, where we've been to, these islands that are Greek islands, you see a lot of Russians. If you go to Egypt, you see a lot of Russians, more so than the Egyptians like sometimes.
Really?
Oh yeah, Oh, when we used to go into Sharm el Sheikh, fly in there to go down there to go into the Red Sea, we go in there, and I would say every hour throughout the day, there was a 747 landing from Russia. Huge amount of Russians come down there because they can get to a warm place. You know, there's nothing warm in Russia. You know, it's like going down to Puerto Vallarta. Puerto Vallarta is suffering now because they're getting Americans to come down there. They're not getting Canadians. Americans can go to Arizona, California, Florida. We have places within our country. We don't have to go out of our country to get to warm weather. Canadians do. And because Canada was anticipating receiving vaccines from the United States, which didn't happen, they are a little bit further behind getting vaccinated. But the Canadians are what drive the economy down there, just like the Russians drive the economy to some degree in the tourist areas of Egypt, especially the beach areas, Sharm el Sheikh and you know, big area like that. So, yeah, it's an interest, but yeah, there would be a 747. So we go to the hotels and stuff like that, and you know, a lot of places when you go overseas, they'll take your passports. They hold onto your passports, kind of a switch for your key in the passport. I always found that a little odd when I went to Russia to give up my passport, because you feel vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what the hotels require. Sometimes they just make a photocopy, but sometimes they ask, and they'll put them in a safe that they keep them for all the guests. But we would show them the U.S. passports, they go, oh, we don't see very many of these around here. Well, because we were living in Europe, there's not a lot of direct flights from the United States to Sharm el Sheikh, you know. But there's a lot of flights from Europe and Russia into Sharm el Sheikh. That's a very busy airport there. But, yeah, they would always go, this is wonderful.
What bothered me in Russia, they'd take your passport at the hotel, wouldn't give it back to you until you left.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. It's absolutely, I mean, and that's the case in many places in the world. It's just that in some countries you have less faith in how the system is going to work. But yeah, we give them our passports and blah, blah. So but they'd always say, oh, we're so thankful you're here. You guys are much nicer than the Russians. Because the Russians just treat them like dirt. They come down there and they've got, you know, these are the people that have the money in Russia to be able to get down there. And so they get down there, and we have witnessed it time and time again. They will treat the other people that are running these hotels, they will not treat them well. That's not always true, but it's generally true. So they like the money that they're getting from the Russians. They don't like the Russians copying an attitude. And Americans can copy an attitude too, I can tell you that. But there, it was much more negative. But the signs were all in Russian, English, probably Arabic, but I'm not sure even of that. But everything was in Russian and in English there, because they have so many Russians that come in there. And Cyprus is the same thing, because it's a Greek Orthodox island. Well, the southern part is, not the northern part. But there's so much Russian money in there. You'll see villas being built up on top of these hills, and it's Russian money. Yeah, it's Russian money.
Really?
Because they can come there, and as much as people, a lot of the Russians don't want to stay in Russia. You know, they'd rather spend their time out and about in a nicer climate, you know, and not have to put up with all the foolishness back home, because there's a lot of foolishness going on there if you haven't kept up on it. So anyway, that's making a way long story. But this was at the bottom of a church. So they were building this, going back to the story, they were building this up until 1917, but when the Bolshevik Revolution came, there was not much appetite in an atheistic country to build churches, even abroad. And so the work stopped on that church. And so the church is still, it's not built. The basement's there, and the well's there, and there's some monks down there that'll sell you icons. as they're always, it's, you know, one of the most remarkable things is always a tourist spot near where things have happened. There's always, you can always buy some stuff. But this is, I do like this one, because this is one of my favorite stories. You know, the Samaritan woman at the well, because there's so much nuance there. You know, she says, well, your people say you have to worship in Jerusalem, and my people say worship up here on the mountaintop. And what does Jesus say? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You know, there's a lot going on in that story. A lot, let alone her interesting past. But the questions that she asked Jesus are spot on good. I mean, they're good questions. She was a smart woman, you know, maybe a little bit ahead of her time, but she didn't mind asking tough questions that were pretty prevalent at that time. Well, let's look at our books here of the Bible that we're going through. We're on, since they're not numbered, I wish I had numbered these pages, but I didn't. So we're on like third page or whatever, it says books. So this is right after we read that quote from Jeremiah 31:31. So it says, the canon of the New Testament, and it's going to tell us what a canon is a collection of books that most Christians regard as divinely inspired and constituting the New Testament of the Christian biblical canon. So canon is a collection. It's not a gun. You haven't hurt anybody with it. It's a collection. The period extending roughly from 50 to 150, and we talked about this a little bit, AD, a number of documents began circulating among the churches. Now remember the churches, this is all during Roman occupation, and so there was no centralized Christian message. It was just pockets of Christians out there where the disciples went out and started. As I said about Matthias, he may have gone up to Georgia and Armenia, up around the north of the Caspian Sea area. You know, but we know that so many of the disciples went out and about and ended up in places all over the place. So these areas grew up with their own understanding of what is sacred scripture. So again, they might have had one gospel, or they might have had 10 letters of Paul, and maybe a gospel lesson too, you know. So after a while, they started sharing, you know, and that's when we start to merge these things together, and we come to the realization that there are 4 gospels, and anyway, 4 gospels that make it in, a number of which did not. So a lot of these are here, it's circulated among the churches, including letters, epistles, gospel accounts, so we have the 4 gospel accounts, memoirs, prophecies, homilies, sermons, and collections of teachings. So there's different layers. I would add another one in there, catechetical, you know, the teaching as well, because that's what the Didache is. While some of these documents were apostolic in origin, in other words, they came out of the apostles, others drew upon a tradition of the apostles and ministers the word had utilized in their individual missions. Still others represented a summation of the teaching entrusted to a particular church center. Several of these writings sought to extend, interpret, and apply apostolic teaching to meet the needs of Christians in a given locality. So the needs of the Christians were what? Who are we? Are we Jewish? Or how much of the pagan part of society do we adhere to? Do we eat meat that's been, you know, dedicated to the god Apollo? You know, these were real questions, right, in the early church and stuff like that. And so try to define themselves in this context in different pockets, you know, some, you know, Ephesus and Damascus and Alexandria, Egypt, you know, these were center power, you know, these were areas where there'd be a large Jewish population, and then after that, because Christianity grew out of the Judaism, then also a Gentile population as well there. But we know, like, the 4 Gospels were probably in each one of those communities. Probably one was in Ephesus, one was in Alexandria. You know, they developed in these areas as the primary, you know, story about who Jesus was. You know, so, and they started to come together, we know, at about before 170, and that's why they were using the date 150 here, because of Muratorian document, which is the one that tells us a little bit about what was going on in the early church. And at that time, we know that there are 4 Gospels that have been established, which I think is quite remarkable, given, again, how do you correspond? You don't email, you don't telephone, you have to send messengers. You know, kind of like Paul, you know, Paul was sending messengers all the time, or he was sending Mark. You know, Mark was one of the messenger Timothy was a messenger, right? These are people that helped. Well, we'll get to that in a minute. But one of the issues is, like, we attribute 13 books, 14 books to Paul. But we know that not all those were written directly by him. And so the question is, were they written by his disciples? Or were they written by people that he did the dictation to? Because their vocabulary would change. In other words, if you're telling me to write something down, I'll write it down, but I'll use my vocabulary. And so like we're going to get to this in a minute. When we get to the book of like Colossians or Ephesians, the vocabulary is quite different. So we don't know if they are written by Paul, or by Paul's disciples, or by Paul dictating to somebody else who's writing down in their own vocabulary what's going on. Because like in Colossians and stuff, there's 44 words that are used in Colossians that are used in no other Paul's writings. Why is that? You know, most of us use the same vocabulary. You know, we have a limited vocabulary, we use it well. Yeah, so this is the way we interpret and we look back at these things and see how they are. We'll get to that Colossians in a minute, because that's, to me, one of the more interesting stories. In general, among Christian denominations, the New Testament is agreed upon 27 books, although they can vary, and we know that the different traditions have different order and different books. Generally the same, though. Next page, Gospels. Each of the 4 Gospels in the New Testament narrates the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. The term gospel literally refers to good news. The word derives from the Old English Godspell, meaning good news or glad tidings. Now I'm going to be singing Godspell songs the rest of the day. Good Lord. One of my favorite musicals. The gospel was considered the good news of the coming kingdom of the Messiah and the redemption through the life and death of Jesus, which is the central Christian message. Gospel is a kalke, word-for-word translation of evangelion. You can see that both in the Greek and then in the English translation. So eureka, right? Eureka? What does that mean? I found something good. EU means good, and angelon, what does that word look like?
Angel.
Angels, yeah, because the word angel and messenger are exactly the same. So the only time we have angels really in the Bible are when they give messages. It's like what we were just talking about, you know, sending somebody to somewhere else, or God sending an angel in here. Or it could be, you could be an angel giving a message as well. So this is that good news. This is that good message that everybody's been waiting for. And what is that? That God loves us in spite of ourselves. You know, and that is good news. But you can certainly see when you do the Greek how the Greek and the English play off of those words there, and how angel and messenger. So you know, the people in the Middle East, or the people in the Roman world, when they would hear that, they would always know that a messenger came. You know, an angel, but it's interchangeable, absolutely interchangeable, the word. Since the 2nd century, the 4 narrative accounts of the life and work of Jesus Christ have been referred to as the Gospel of, or the Gospel according to, following the name of the supposed author. Whatever these admittedly early ascriptions may imply about the sources behind or the perception of these Gospels, they appear to have been originally anonymous compositions. So all 4 of the Gospels are originally they're not signed off by anybody, but they are attributed to somebody, and we have good reason to believe that those people that are named in the Gospels had something to do with the formation of that Gospel. Gospel of Matthew. This Gospel begins with what we know, the genealogy of Jesus. Why would he do that? Because we need to study honor shame in this class, because when we talk about Western thinking, we talk about Middle Eastern or Far East thinking. those cultures are honor-shame societies. We don't live in an honor-shame society, except for two instances in the United States, our military and social media. Those places are both honor-shame environments. That's why we don't understand what's going on. So the genealogy is important because for Matthew, he's preaching to Jewish Christians. He wants to make a case, and he's going to quote from the Old Testament a lot, that Jesus is the fulfillment of the expectation of the Messiah. But to know someone in that culture, you need to know who they are and what their background is. And so genealogies, we see them, this genealogy is important because it's going to prove that going back to David, who was, the consummate Israelite, that Jesus was an offshoot of that family. So that genealogy is very important to establish that very early on when you're starting to talk about someone. So like if you go to Bethlehem or you go anywhere, they would ask you about your family. Who are you related to? I was in the car in Bethlehem. We were going down the road over by Bet Shala, another small little Arab community. We were going along one of those crappy roads I was telling you about, because you can't go very fast. And so Michael rolled down his window, and a woman drives by, but they're going so slow they can talk to each other because it's that bad a road. And so they start talking, and then he laughs a little bit. He looks back and he says, "We think we're related." but it was a genealogy conversation. And he knows it. He's lived there up and he's been there forever. But that kind of a background is just so important in the Middle East, is to establish, and the Far East, Japan's the same way, honor, shame, We had friends that came over, I think I may have shared this, left their iPad at Narita Airport, got to our house 70 miles away in Tokyo, and they just threw up their hands and said, "Well, we lost that one." And we said, "No, you didn't. Well, let's call the airport and they'll have it." "No, they won't have it. Somebody's picked it up and no, this is a different society. You have to understand. They will not bring shame onto the Japanese society by stealing something. They won't. If the Japanese play a soccer game at a stadium, when they get done, they clean up the whole stadium, both sides, because cleanliness is next to godliness. Purity, and see, when you talk about honor-shame society, purity is a key word. To have that pure sacrifice of the sheep coming in there. Anything that's pure. And so what happens is, you have this honor, shame, and this purity, and then you have Jesus who comes and says, "No, that's all good, but no, that's not the way we're going to do this. We're all Satan center. We're all Lutheran terminology, but we're all a mixed bag here." He didn't want people. That was one of the things he opposed, was a bit of the honor, shame, although he existed within that context. The other thing that he really opposed was the belief that if you have something wrong with you, it's because you've done something wrong. In other words, if you had let's say you had a speech impediment, which I feel like I have now. But let's say you had a speech impediment, they would say, well, you've done something wrong, or your parents have done something wrong. There has to be a blame, there has to be a shame, a blame that's attributed to that. And of course, Jesus is going along all the time and sitting there going, "That's not how God's economy works." He talks about, when the aqueduct fell down and killed 12 people and all these things, and he says, were they any worse than anybody else? And the answer is a rhetorical question. The answer is, no, they're not. So Jesus was constantly fighting some of these nuances which were not helpful in that society, just plain and simple. Were not helpful, to blame other people, to feel the need to do that, and we all do to some degree, but specifically to shame people in that society. Honor-shame society is you live in a public eye. Everything that you do is public. It's open for everybody to see. We live in a very privatized society, privatized, individualistic world. That does not work in a lot of the world. They're much more communal based, and they're much more public. Everything is out in public. You know, in the time of Jesus, as beforehand, if you had something that you wanted to debate, where would you go? You went to the city gate. The city gate was where you debated things. So whoever, if somebody came and was accused of adultery or something like that, they could be stoned outside the city gate, like Stephen was. I mean, he wasn't accused of adultery, but he was taken outside the city. Capital punishment could never take place within the city. That's why Jesus was crucified on Golgotha, the place of the skull, which was outside the city wall. Three things: it had to be outside the city wall, it had to be near roads, and it had to be up high, so it was propaganda. Those are the three criteria for a crucifixion. Okay, that's what always happened. So the debate would always take place at the gate, because that would determine if you were going to be in or out of the community. So let's say you did something bad, but they're not going to stone you for it, but they're going to exclude you out of the community. This is why the story of the Prodigal Son is so important, because had the townspeople received him, they would have killed him, because of the shame that he had brought upon both his father and his older brother. The townspeople, that's why he gets up. The dad gets up, and what does he do? He gathers up his dress, all, whatever you want to call it, and he runs. Because he has to get to his son first. Because if the neighbors get to him first, that'll be the end of his son. You see how weighty that story is? Genealogy was very important. You had to know the family. Because if your parents were honorable, then chances are you're honorable. You know, I can trust you a little bit. But that's what they always, you know, to know the background is so important in so many societies. Not so in the United States, right? We don't really, that's not a huge priority. We're much more of a mixing pot. We're not a homogeneous group of anything. So again, individualistic. When we talk about the Western mindset, we're talking about the individual. When we talk about the Eastern mindset, we're talking about the community. And the Jewish is out of the community. You know, they're very community oriented. How else can a group of people survive for 2,000 years without a country? Name another group that's lasted 2,000 years without a country. No, it doesn't happen. But they've maintained their identity through their religion for an awfully long time through some awfully difficult situations. My hat is totally off to them for that. Now, with the Palestinian debate, I'm not so fond of how some of them play that out. But I know that, again, when we talk about the Israeli people, it's not one group. It's quite different there. Okay? So again, honor, shame, I will bring that up multiple times in here. I've got 6 handouts that I have on it, because when I go into larger churches, I do, that's my first Bible study, is I do honor, shame. Because until you have that context, a lot of what you read in the Bible doesn't make as much sense. Once you understand the honor, shame context, it opens, little light bulbs go off. Because you go, oh, I didn't see that before. No, why would you? Because, you know, until we're in tune to their understanding of society, we really can't understand some of these things that were written at that time. The Gospel of Mark begins with the preaching of John the Baptist. Well, let's go back up there. The Gospel begins with the genealogy, Gospel of Matthew, of Jesus, and the birth story. Includes the visit of the Magi and the flight to Egypt, because for Matthew, Jesus was the new Messiah, or the new Moses. Where, in some of the other ones, he's the new David. but here he's the new Moses in many ways. This flight to Egypt. And it ends with the commissioning of the disciples by the resurrected Jesus. Okay? Gospel of Matthew begins with the preaching of John the Baptist and the baptism of Jesus. A lot more John the Baptist in the Gospel of Mark. And 2 different endings were added, because both Mark and John, we don't have clear endings to either one of them. We have multiple endings that were added on, or the scroll was busted up at one time, or whatever. That just happens. The gospel, by the way, the Gospel of Mark is probably, we think, more the memoir of Peter. If John Mark was attributed as the writer, John Mark hung around Peter a lot, and so it would be much more, because, Peter should write a gospel, right? I mean, he was kind of like an important person. Well, we think it's in Mark. And that's why Mark's gospel is also the earliest, and that would make sense if Peter was behind it. Okay? Gospel of Luke, and again now, the Gospel of Luke, as we go down through these, they're going more Gentile. So the Gospel of Matthew, definitely more Jewish, Christian. Gospel of Mark, kind of in between. By the time you get to the Gospel of Luke, you're writing to a Gentile audience, a non-Jewish audience. And he was not one of the 12 apostles. So you have 4 Gospels here attributed, but both Mark and Luke are not apostles. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, we don't think of that because we're so used to looking at it and just say, oh, well, these were followers of Jesus. True, but 2 of the 4 Gospels are attributed to non-apostles. We know who they are, and we know they were important. It's just that, again, it's evolving from going to a Jewish world to a Gentile world.
Maybe the 2 apostles couldn't write,
Yeah.
so they had somebody else write it down.
Well, that was oftentimes true. The only trouble is Luke is a physician. We know he just has bad penmanship because he's a doctor. But we know he can write. Seriously. I mean, he's one that we know he can write. I mean, because again, 5% of the world back then could read or write. We think it's all over the place, but again, it was a small percentage of people that had those abilities, and so they were educated. The boys in Judaism, of course, went to synagogue school, and there they would learn, how to read and write. Same in Islam now. You go there and you memorize the Quran, and that's when they sometimes will then do their circumcision, is after you've memorized the Quran. So sometimes the kids are 10 to 12 to 13 years old before they're circumcised, because that's a tradition within a certain part of Islam. The boys don't really want to have anything cut at that time. You can imagine, so it's a little dicey, but usually they do it earlier. But I've seen them later as well, particularly in Istanbul. So, Gospel of Luke was a companion to the Apostle Paul and a doctor. This Gospel begins with parallel stories of the birth and childhood of John the Baptist and Jesus, and ends with the appearance of the resurrected Jesus and his ascension into heaven. Okay? Again, we're going to go into a lot more detail. We're just like a rock skimming across the pond. We're going to get deeper here in a bit. The Gospel of John begins with the philosophical, prologue, the word, the logos. It ends with the appearance of the resurrected Jesus. And it's about Jesus' miracles. It's also the sign gospel. It has signs throughout. And these signs point to the identity of who Jesus was. So we have stories like the miracle of turning the water into wine in Cana, or we have Nicodemus at night, in John 3. We have stories in there because John is a supplement. He knows these other, okay, next line, let's go down here. The first 3 Gospels are classified as the synoptic gospel. Syn means one, optic means eye. One eye. They're seeing the same thing. So Mark, Matthew, and Luke are synoptic. John is a supplement. He's writing stories that are not paralleled in, for the most part, except towards the resurrection stories. And then there is more parallels that are going on. But John is the gospel of signs, and he's writing it to a Gentile audience, trying to prove that Jesus is the Word, Logos, because he's translating who Jesus was into a concept that the Greek world would know about. And Logos, Word, was very important. The Word, even in Hebrew scripture, right? God spoke the word into the world into being, right? Through the word, through his word. So, this was an interesting, so we see this evolution, this movement of this telling the story of Jesus as contextual is now changing by the time we get to Luke and John into a more Greek world. And we're a little bit more comfortable with that because we come out of that same, Greco-Roman world, which is more European than it is Middle Eastern. So synoptic, so if I say that's the three Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. They contain similar accounts of the events of Jesus' life and his teachings, especially his teachings, due to their literary interdependence. The Gospel of John is structured differently and includes several miracles of Jesus and sayings that are not found in the other three. The four Gospels were eventually included in the New Testament, were only a few among many other early Christian Gospels. The existence of such texts is even mentioned at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. It says there has been many and various accounts written, but I am here to write this to Theophilus. Remember, both of them are attributed to Theophilus. Is that a real person's name? Because it means the lover of God, right? Theo is God, and Philophilus, Philadelphia, city of brotherly love. Maybe not. Not on some days. So we have this here. So the Bible tells us that there were other Gospels by the time Luke comes along. So Luke admits, is he referring to Mark and to Matthew? Yes. Is he alluding to maybe more? Possibly. We don't know. So we also have the Gospel of Thomas here mentioned, that was found in 1945 in Agamadi, right north of Luxor, along the Nile River. We knew it existed. We didn't know we still had a copy of it because so much has been lost over the years. And it's a great one because it has the same sayings that Matthew and Luke have, these parable sayings. In 2 weeks we're going to be hearing Jesus say, I'm going to speak only through parables to the disciples, because this storytelling was an important part of allowing the disciples to do the homework themselves. In other words, Jesus was not always one to say, well, this is what you need to believe, but Jesus would tell a parable and then say, how do you interpret this? Your work, all of us as followers, is to interpret. What does this mean? What do these stories mean? How do they affect me? What's going on here? So anyway, Gospel of Thomas is a great one too, because it has most of the parables that we see in Matthew and Luke. And Thomas now, not so much Mark. So we have Mark. Then we have Luke. Then we have Matthew. Then we have Thomas. I'm not going to put John down here somewhere. So you have some interdependence on this. So here's these. And what do we have common here? Parables. All three of these have the same parable stories. Mark, not so much. Mark is a thumbnail. It's the template, but it's the briefest gospel. A lot briefer than Luke and Matthew. Because Mark's whole idea is to get to the story of the crucifixion and the resurrection as fast as possible. He didn't really care so much about Jesus' life, and later on, then the other writers came and added more stories that they'd heard from the other disciples and other followers about who Jesus was. But this is the thing that unites these three, is the parables. They're almost exactly word for word the same.
How close are the Dead Sea Scrolls to what we have today? What's written in this book, is it very close to what Does Dead Sea Scrolls say?
Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls are, again, the intertestamental period, so they were written sometime between 250 BC and 50 AD, probably, around the time of Jesus. Again, we think that even John the Baptist could have been one of the people that was participating in the community that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, the thing that was astounding about the Dead Sea Scrolls that really astounded scientists and scholars was that before the Dead Sea Scrolls, our oldest Hebrew Bible of the entire Old Testament was dated 1000 AD. That was the oldest translation. And so many scientists and many scholars said, well, because this was all handwritten, they said, well, there's probably a lot of mistakes in it, over time, because if you're going to, we all make mistakes when we write things out, and if we all have physicians' handwriting, we can understand why. And so we have the Dead Sea Scrolls to give us the Old Testament that's 1,000 years older than the one that we had. And we found that it was word for word, almost exactly.
Like,
Yeah,
really?
yeah. And that was probably the biggest discovery, that the scholars over the years had been very accurate in their translation work and in their writing it down, handwriting, because it's a big book, right? 66 books. It's a corpus. It's a collection. Canon. Use the word canon. So the Bible's not homogeneous at all. It's been written at different times to different cultures. What brings it all together is this thing called faith in God. What is this? How does that play out within Judaism, historically? Heilige Geschichte, that's German for holy history, holy writings. That was theirs, and then with Jesus, we have the New Testament that augments that and sees that as a fulfillment, that Jesus as a fulfillment of some of those Old Testament prophecies. So, that's a long story to make it, but yes, that was one of the significant things, is that we learned that the Bible, or the Old Testament at least, and generally the Bible, but was much more accurate than scientists ever. And it really surprised a lot of people. And they came out and said it. I cannot believe how accurate, over time, the translations have been. And that blew away people. And it gave, in the scientific world, it gave the Bible quite a bit more credibility than it had before. People took it, some scientists took it really much more seriously, because they had this to fall back on and say, look, this is so accurate. They're almost word for word, the same. 1,000 years different. 1,000 years.
Yeah, with archaeology, they're finding that some of the stuff written in the Old Testament is actual truth.
Yeah, what is truth? But yeah, the problem with the Old Testament is we don't have a lot of archaeological evidence. We know the communities and where they lived, and we know the books, some of that stuff. So we have that. Archaeology is only 200 years old. Up until that time, well, what's the capital of Israel? Tel Aviv, right? Tel means mound.
Means what?
Mound something. So in the old days, they would just, when a war took place, then the next people would come in and they would rebuild right in the same place, because they had rubble to make their new buildings, and they also probably had water, because there was water there for the old community. And so over time, and over in the Middle East, you'll have these tells in Tel Aviv. These big mounds, which are just rubble from the city being destroyed time and time again. And that's why they just reused things. By the way, they did that in the writings too. A lot of the writings that we have on some of the translations are rewritten on something that has been, they've gone through and leached out the ink before, and they reused it again. A lot of the documents have been reused for new writings, because the papyrus and stuff, and the skins that were used, especially the Dead Sea Scroll, one of which is bronze, by the way, they reused them because they needed to, you know. But the communities, you know, would build on these rubbles and hence they had no appreciation for the past. It's really been only the last 200 years or so. I mean, obviously, people have had appreciation from the past. I mean, the patristic fathers, the early church had a great understanding of things, but there wasn't that appreciation, and there wasn't the scientific community that came and said, let's do those things. Let's figure this out. Because if we can figure out our past, we can figure out a lot more about who we are and where we're going. But there hasn't been that, so it's only a recent skill set is to be an archaeologist. If you go over to Israel, if you go, well, a lot of places, Egypt as well, you know, you go along, and there'll be groups out on a dig all the time, and you go over and talk to them and find out what university they're from, usually from the United States, sometimes from
England.
sometimes England, sometimes from other places in Europe, you know. So there's much more of an appetite to understand things now, and we have the tools to do it. Radiocarbon data, you know, we can date things back. And that's why some of these things are just messing us up.
Is Tel Aviv, have they done extensive archaeology work there?
Well, I doubt it. Some places, the problem is, it's like the 7 churches of Revelation that are in Turkey, is that the communities now are on top of it, so they can't dig them out. You know, it's really hard. The nice thing is when people don't rebuild on the ruins, that's where you can learn a lot, because it's not been messed up by future builds. You know, my last one, and you're gonna hear this from time to time again. Go back way. So this Tepe. This is turning the world on its head when it comes to archaeology. This is Göbekli Tepe, which means potbelly hill in Turkish. And it's in southern Turkey, right on the Syrian border. And what they have found there is, they found ruins of a civilization. There we go.
Ruins.
We can get that cleaned up. We found ruins of a civilization that goes back to 9,000 BC. And it's a sophisticated culture, and the Germans were the ones to excavate this recently. But see, we believe that architecture and the wheel were discovered by the Samaritans, in Samaria, in and around 3500 BC, that the written language started, and things like that. And now we're finding that's not true, that there was a lot more sophisticated civilizations back around the time of 10,000 BC. We don't know what happened, if there was another ice age or what happened, but it's obvious that some of the things that they could do in 10,000 BC were things that they couldn't do a couple thousand years later. So look this up. There's still not a lot. They've only uncovered about 10% of this. They're using ground penetrating radar. But this thing, and it's changing our whole view of the past. We cut it off when written language came. You know, we had these markers, and now we realize these markers aren't true at all, that there were other things going on. To be able to build these monuments that are there, that predate Stonehenge by 7,000 years, blows people away. We don't know what to do with it. So this is the Germans are in charge of this dig.
Yeah, there's been a little bit on the History Channel about that.
Yeah. It is changing everything on how we understand archaeology, history, culture, civilization, language. You know,
Is that in central Turkey, or?
it's right on the border. It's right on the border, just north of that town that it was in Syria that they blew the smithereens out of. So it's about 20 kilometers north of the border. So it's in central Turkey. So if you went to Damascus and you went way up north and got into Turkey, that's where it would be. It'd be the closest thing I could point you out to. I know people who, I've known other pastors who have gone there to look at it because they know that this is going to be, once it's more discovered, a significant turning understanding of how history is. And we're learning again that maybe we're not so linear. Maybe there's been ups and downs in the knowledge of history. And so it may be at a time around 10,000 BC that there was kind of a golden age, and that there were some pretty sophisticated, I mean, there were cities and towns back then. We didn't believe that was possible. We thought it was all agricultural at that time. And these monuments, we think, are religious. We think they came together for the purpose of religious things, rather than to have cities and then religion come into the cities. This seems to be some type of a pilgrimage place, and they just don't understand it. And it's huge. And in about 7,000 BC, they backfilled the whole thing, and it's been lost since then. And they don't know why, because the work it took to build it was incredible. The work that it took to bury it and why, they have no clue. No clue at all. But again, just...
So when was it discovered?
Well, it was discovered in the 60s, but the Germans didn't get there until maybe early 80s. Again, the Turkish farmers were out there and they were plowing, they keep on hitting things. And that it was the top of these you know what I'm talking about, these monuments that were there. And when the Germans came in, they started excavating and they were going, oh my gosh, and a whole lot more oh my goshes. Because when they started radiocarbon dating this stuff, and it just blew them away how much older it was than it's just changed everything. It just has. Now we know there's a couple of other communities nearby that are probably this old as well. But again, this is the top of the Fertile Crescent. Why am I not using a map where I can't use a map? You asked a good question. So, if you went right over, about up in here is about where it is.
Yeah. Right.
So, again, Damascus is down here, we don't quite have Tarsus. So it's just, we don't go that far on that, but that's where it is. So it's really far south and down here.
Does the Vatican fund any of this research?
Well, yeah, Vatican, well, not this, but the Vatican does. I mean, they have some digs and stuff like that in different places in the world. This one, because it's not related to Christianity, you know, this is Germans. Ephesus is Austrians. I mean, it's funny because different countries went in and because it's very expensive to do archaeology. Very expensive, you know, because it's so time and, you know, expensive just to have that many people in there digging up little things and then putting them together, and you know, we know of so much that needs to be explored. We just don't have the resources in the world right now to do it, or we're not applying those resources to learn more about it. So.
Some archaeology in Pakistan and Afghanistan also shows that there were, you know, civilizations going back even beyond, you know, the Fertile Crescent time. You know, so, you know, there's a lot we don't know.
Yeah, well, and that's what's exciting is we do know that now in China there was always a big, you know, big civilization, the Indus Valley down in that area. That's the area where Pakistan and Afghanistan, India, that's where all the pot marijuana came out of, the different areas down there. I mean, it's true. And came out of there. But one of the other things that came out of there was migration. And so if you go to Europe to this day and you go around and you go run across what they call gypsies. They're really
Romani people now is the politically correct.
Correct, Romas or, yes. We as Lutherans work on this, and I'll tell you why, and then I'll cut it off. But, so these people immigrated up from there, and so when you look at the Roma people, they are darker complected than most others, because they come out of that background down there in the Indus River area. And they've come up there, of course, they have not they're another group that was really persecuted by the Nazis as well, because they didn't have any value.